Snow didn't fall that night. It pressed down, heavy, wet, suffocating. It clung to skin, soaked through fabric, crawled into bone. The Frostvale court stood beneath towering stone pillars, already buried in frost, their cloaks damp, their breath thick in the freezing air. No one moved. No one spoke. Because at the center of it all, kneeling in snow that had begun to swallow her knees, was Elara Voss. Her dress was soaked through, clinging to her skin, dragging her down. Her fingers were buried in slush that burned like ice and fire at once. And still, she didn't move. "Step forward," the High Elder commanded. Elara didn't respond immediately. Moving meant feeling. Feeling meant pain. 2 guards stepped forward, their boots sinking deep into wet snow, grabbing her arms. The moment they lifted her, her legs almost gave out. Too cold, too numb, too heavy, but she forced herself upright, because falling would mean they were right. Across the courtyard, through the thick curtain of falling snow, stood the man they had chosen, a stranger. Tall, still, watching. Kyle Draven. Snow gathered on his shoulders, and he didn't brush it away. "Elara Voss," the elder's voice echoed. "You are hereby released from Frostvale and placed under the custody of Kyle Draven." Released. The words scraped through her mind like broken ice. Released from what? From being invisible? From being blamed? Her lips almost curved. Almost. Her eyes lifted, locking onto Kyle. He didn't react. "Take her." The shove came suddenly. Her boots slipped in soaked snow, cold water pushing deeper into her skin. And just like that, they handed her to a stranger. The gates slammed shut behind them. The sound swallowed instantly by snow. Elara walked, or tried to. Each step dragged. Her clothes were heavy now, soaked and freezing with every second. Her fingers stiff, her breath uneven. Kale didn't slow, didn't look back. "You're not even going to ask if I'm alive?" she forced out. "You are," he replied. "That's your standard? You're still walking." Her foot slipped. She dropped hard to one knee. Cold shot up her body like a blade. For a second, she almost stayed there. Then she pushed herself up, because the ground felt like death, and she wasn't giving it that. By the time they reached Blackwood, she was shaking uncontrollably. The forest loomed ahead, dark, wet, alive. Snow here wasn't soft. It was heavy, soaked, dragging at her boots, pulling her down. The cold no longer touched her skin. It lived inside it. And Kale stopped beneath a broken arch of trees and built a fire. The flames struggled, then held. Elara didn't move toward it. "You'll collapse," he said. "I won't." "You already are." Her body trembled harder. "I said I'm fine." He looked at her fully. "No, you're freezing." The word landed differently. Not judgment. Recognition. She stepped forward slowly and sank near the fire. The warmth didn't comfort. It burned. Her fingers twitched as feeling returned, sharp and painful. She sucked in a breath. "Why did you take me?" she asked. The fire cracked between them. "You were not meant to survive there," he said. Her brows tightened. "And here I am." His gaze lifted. "Yes, and that's exactly why they let you go." Days passed, but the cold didn't break her. It changed her. At first, she thought she was losing feeling. And then she realized she wasn't. She was adapting. Her breathing steadied. Her steps grew lighter. The snow no longer dragged her the same way. It responded differently. One morning, she stood still as snow soaked into her hair, her skin, her clothes. But she didn't shiver. Not anymore. "What's happening to me?" she whispered. "You're becoming what you were meant to be," Kale said behind her. She turned. I was meant to freeze to death? No, you were meant to survive it. He led her to a clearing where a stone stood buried in ice. Ancient, waiting. Touch it, he said. The cold around it felt deeper, heavier, alive. She stepped forward anyway and pressed her hand against it. The world shifted. The cold rushed through her, not against her, inside her, expanding, awakening. She gasped and fell back into the snow. But it didn't feel like it was swallowing her. It felt like it was holding her. What am I? She breathed. Kale stepped closer. They didn't send you away because you were weak, he said quietly. They sent you away because you were the only one who could survive this. When Frostvale began to fall apart, they understood too late. The storms worsened. The cold grew heavier, more violent, more alive. Wolves at the borders turned unstable. Supplies froze. Fear spread faster than the wind. Find her, the elder ordered, but the words lacked the certainty they once held. Because deep down, he already knew. She wasn't lost. She was beyond them now. Elara felt them before they arrived. Riders, soldiers, desperation. They're coming, she said. Kale nodded. I know. The riders emerged through the snow, cloaks heavy, weapons drawn. While their confidence faltered the moment they saw her. She stood still, snow soaking into her clothes, her hair, her skin, but untouched by it in a way they couldn't explain. You will return, their leader said. Elara stepped forward slowly, calm, steady. No. The word cut clean through the storm. The wind shifted around her, not violently, naturally, as if it listened. The riders hesitated. They could feel it. She wasn't the girl they had cast out anymore. They need you, Kyle said later. Elara let out a quiet breath. They didn't need me when they left me to freeze. This isn't about them. She turned to him. Then what is it about? His gaze held hers. You. Silence stretched. Then she nodded once. Not in submission. Indecision. The storm was worse when she returned. Thicker. Heavier. Blinding. By the same courtyard now buried deeper beneath snow and ice. The same pillars now frozen solid. The same people, now afraid. Elara walked forward slowly, her clothes still soaked, her body still carrying the cold, but no longer breaking under it. Her steps were steady, controlled, unstoppable. The gates opened without command. No one dared stop her. You came back, the High Elder said, his voice thinner than before. Elara stopped, snow falling heavily around her, melting against her skin, freezing again. But she didn't react. She didn't feel it the same way anymore. No, she said calmly. I survived. Silence crushed the courtyard. And in that moment, they understood. They hadn't just given her away. They had thrown away the only thing that could endure what was coming. Well, if they left you in the cold, watched you break, expected you to disappear, but you survived everything meant to destroy you, would you go back for them, or let them face the storm alone? Comment, return, or leave them right now. And subscribe, because the next story will be even colder and even darker.